Hey everyone, it's Monica Perez. We are here with my favorite finance nerd, Jason Purcell. Hey Jason, how are you doing?
Hey, good, and I'm 100% okay with that description. I like it a lot. Let's go ahead
How
and
could
hold
you
on
how
to it.
could you not own that?
I'm owning it. I'm owning it.
Yeah,
We're all good, baby.
Perf.
All good here.
So
I
you're
mean
gonna give
that
us
in like a yeah. No, go ahead.
you're gonna give us an economic update. I love it. Nobody's thinking
Yeah.
about the economics right now because all the like each of the rings of the circus is filled with like juggling politician and there's just no room for real stuff like nummies.
Circus is a good way to put it. You could also call it three ring shit show, and you're right. All of the three rings are in the air.
Yes,
It's crazy.
absolutely. Yes.
One thing that I noticed is that over the weekend, while everybody was talking about the assassination uh
Alleged
event, alleged
alleged assassination
event,
attempts.
yeah,
Can I
event
ask your
where
opinion on it, or is that bad?
yeah,
Okay, moving.
so
Forget
yeah,
it. Don't. It
no, no,
makes
no,
enemies, so forget it.
yeah, no, it certainly does. I think it's quite obvious that what is being presented as the narrative is totally not what happened. But I also don't think that like if this was a deep state plot or whatever, which is what the
Yeah.
Trump fans are
Yes.
taking to believing, there's just way too many plot holes in that story for me,
Agreed.
including who they put up to it. And the weirdest thing to me actually was I've never seen Trump present a chart at a rally. I was telling a friend that
Oh,
the
I
other day.
wondered about that. I
Yeah.
wondered because that's quite a thing to do, like to put
Hmm.
a huge billboard and say, that's weird.
A chart on a jumbotron. Yeah, yeah, and to get everybody to look to the right at that particular moment.
Yeah. And he
Um,
said, "Oh, they're getting better at this," as if he does it all the time, but that was weird that he said they're getting better at this, I thought.
mhm. Yeah, and so that's one thing where I really need to go back and maybe just do a little bit more. I mean, I don't know how much. I'm not really going to sink a whole lot of time into
I'm not
this.
interested in it either. People are sending me videos, and I
It's
understand that if that you wanna know the answer, but I think it's much more important, like, all the stuff that's falling out of these events than how exactly those events got started. Because
agreed.
I'm not a fanboy of anything. I don't believe in politics. So it doesn't matter to me
Me
if
neither.
Trump was in on it or wasn't in on it, like, because I don't, I like the Bill of Rights. Some people have a problem with that, but I like the Bill of Rights, and I don't hear anybody talking about that. So I don't
Nope.
see any saviors on the horizon.
I agree, and you know what? I'm really thinking this year. Um, the last thing I heard about Trump's plans for his new swamp-free cabinet, or that he's going to appoint either Larry Fink or the or the head of J.P. Morgan, Jamie Dimon. So I think I'm going to write in Ron Paul,
Yeah. Oh, I
which is a
always write in
tradition I
my fault.
know.
That's all
Yeah, I
I
know that
do.
you're familiar
But
with.
it's funny. The Scott and William. I don't know if you know them. They're podcasters. They use the expression nominative determinism.
Hmm.
Nominative determinism.
Oh,
So,
I don't know what
like
that means.
diamond. It means like um I'm trying to think of what. Well, in this case, it would be diamond. Is going to be rich. Fink is like a bad guy. So
Hmm.
you become what your name is.
Okay,
So,
I think
crooks
I'm
is a
following.
crook,
Right.
you know.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay, yeah, yeah,
you
yeah. I
you you
gotcha.
become what you're named. I'm trying to think there are such amazing examples. Like it's such a
Mhm.
crazy thing. Like when you hear it, you're just like, oh, my favorite is Hussein Bolt.
Oh,
He's
yeah,
like
because
the
he's
fastest
fast.
person
Yeah.
ever.
Mhm,
And I just think that's funny. So
mhm.
anyway, there's so like which do you want in treasury? Diamonds or finks?
Right. And I'm like, neither would be
Yes.
awesome, but, I mean,
Yeah, no,
if it's
it's
gotta be a
not.
banker, give me the head of, like, a tier 2 major, like a $100 billion in assets and less,
Yeah.
one of the smaller players in
Have you ever
the
read
industry,
Fink's
but
backstory?
no, no, not I'm
Oh,
not
he
that
was a
familiar with it.
spectacular failure. Like I feel like he's just a face job. Like this, he's
Oh.
not even the guy. He's not. I used to work for a guy. who was genius, and he ran one of those big companies later on. I'm not saying he's a great guy, but he was obviously the guy running the show, and he was like, how people say like you're borderline autistic when you can just focus them or whatever, but like that's
Hmm.
it. I just a lot of times I feel like I just don't believe a guy who started out as a spectacular failure, like think to
Hmm.
be this guy, super successful. I feel like he's a face job or a politician or whatever. I don't know. Jamie Dimon seems like he's actually doing the job, but
Yeah,
anyway,
Jamie Dimon's somebody who's actually impressive,
yeah, he's doing the
on
job.
paper and when you
But
hear him talk.
but yes, I agree with you. Like a smaller guy is a guy who's actually doing it and is probably fighting for his life out there every day and not
Hmm.
wheeling and dealing. But the more I read about the corruption and how corruption works, it's just all about like all the policies, all the deals seem to me about who's getting what money. And if you heard Netanyahu today in Congress, I mean, the crowd was going wild as if he was talking about their own country.
Yeah, that's
Like,
ridiculous.
why do you guys love him so much? It's just ridiculous.
Yeah,
It's
and
not funny. I did not like that. It's like borderline treason to like, uh, fawn over another country as if it's your own.
it absolutely is. I mean, I'm quite partial to the Irish, but I don't go around saying like Erin go bragh, that country is so awesome, and every young man within draft age needs to be ready to go die for Ireland,
Right. Or the
It's just
Vatican. I like to think of it as the Vatican.
yeah.
Imagine if the Vatican were under attack and they were like, "We need help," and I was to suggest that we send all our tax money and everything over there. It would not be well, maybe with the new regime and the crazy stuff they're starting with Catholic integralism and stuff. I can't get into that. Anyway, yeah, so now while the world's eyes are on the circus, where are your eyes, Jason?
That's a really good way to set it up. So double points for just interview skill there. Um, yeah, so it is really interesting that when the economy is not really doing anything, but everybody's just thinking that it's about to do something, then everybody's attention is on the economy. I just find it wild that for the last 2 years, or specific pockets of the last 2 years, people have been all over the place calling for a recession and a market crash and all those kinds of things because of rising interest rates and inflation and that type of stuff. And when I first started creating content, I was kind of on that boat too. It was early 2021. I was thinking that this business cycle was going to play it out a lot, was going to play out a lot faster than it did. And the economy was in the news really, really often. I mean, it was like there was its own bull market in macroeconomic commentary. So it's been really interesting that over the last couple years, it was such a big thing for different segments of time throughout the last couple years, and now that to me something is actually happening, nobody's talking about it you know and so what is actually happening, the final straw to drop in my mind is really the labor market. So if you look at unemployment over the history of the business cycle, it tends to be the case that when unemployment goes up, that's when you're either a recession has already started or a recession starts. It's kind of like a coincident or sometimes even a lagging indicator. And unemployment, as far as just like macroeconomic theory is concerned, like if you ask a good Austrian or probably somebody from the Chicago school, the Keynesians say like unemployment causes the recession, which is just ridiculous because it's like, why did the layoffs happen in the first
Well,
place
they
if,
just want
if
to make an excuse for
intervention?
deficit spending.
Sure. So it kind of makes sense the order that it plays out in because the layoffs are the side effect of whatever is causing the recession. They themselves are not the cause of the economic downturn. They're a result, a symptom. And so what's going on right now is that we're about 0.7% off of the cycle low, what I have called the cycle low in unemployment. So that was 3.4%, which is very low relative to history.
Hmm.
Of course, it's measured differently now than
Yeah,
it
I
was
was gonna
like back in the
say. I mean,
50s.
half the people
Yeah.
don't work,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And
Yeah, and they've
as an aside, the way it really annoys me because they had this big push to get women into the workplace and to
mhm,
outsource like uh family care, and then only half people work. So,
right. Mm.
it's not like they needed to double the labor pool. They just wanted to destroy the family, but whatever.
Yeah, and some, I've heard some theories about what happened in the 70s with, the rise of two-income households and all those kinds of things as more of a capitalist ploy to kind of increase the supply of labor. But to me, that just reads like what ended up happening is that you have to pay two people salaries and benefits when you could have just as easily paid one
Benefits,
person
yeah.
salaries and
Mhm.
benefits. So to me, that just looks like, to the extent that wages have gone down, which when you do look at median incomes compared to inflation, the the talking point, especially among progressives, is that they haven't kept pace since the 70s. And my read on the data is that they have, not as much as they would in more of a deflationary or like a price stable world. But my reading on the data really is that they have. And they
Hmm.
have kept pace with productivity. There's a lot of misinformation. And when I say misinformation, I really do mean
Yes,
misinformation, not the
yes.
way that the lizard people say it.
Yes.
Um, but there's a chart that a lot of people pass around from the Economic Policy Institute, which purports to show labor productivity and the average hourly or weekly pay of workers or something like that. And you see this divergence start in the 1970s. And really, what that's a product of, I'll try to post about this on Twitter or something so people kind of know what I'm talking about. Um, but really, what that's a product of is that the measure of productivity, which is GDP per hour of per hours worked, basically, is deflated by a different type of price index than the wage number. And so, if you deflate two different measures by two different numbers,
Yes.
then you're going to get different results as soon as those two different indexes that you're measuring against start to diverge. And so
And
it's just
yeah.
a statistically flawed analysis, but people still pass it around even on the right.
I think it might defy statistics a little bit. First of all, there's no chance we're not more productive. It's just not
Than we were 50
conceivable.
years ago? No,
Yes.
I agree.
It's just not
Absolutely.
conceivable. So
Totally
I
not
just don't
conceivable. Yeah.
even I don't want to see charts. I don't care about that.
Hmm.
However, if you want to say like what does it mean to be lower middle class? I grew up lower middle class. And I think the lower middle class style of living, like when you
Hmm.
say standard of living, it feels relative, but style of living seems much higher to me now than it was then. I could be wrong. I could be misinterpreting it, but I just feel like just because of things are convenient, the conveniences are so less you make your life so much less annoying. Like cars are
Hmm.
more reliable. I mean, I just can't tell you how many times we've had to walk home in the snow because the car broke down, And that just doesn't or even just the fact that my father was a truck driver and he'd have to stop and pull over and use a map, or he'd have to find a payphone to call us. And
Hmm.
I mean, technology is probably the beginning of the end, but not only does it make you more productive at work, but it just makes your life so much easier at that level. It seems to me that just the daily aggravation of doing things is just so much lower than it used to be. So I don't know if I think it maybe defies kind of statistical measure like that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's also kind of my understanding that the average household really only had one car back then. Also, the average house was smaller than mine. So I live in an 1,800 square foot house. or I guess 19 if you round up. But my dad and there's only two people and one dog who live here. There's me, my brother, and my
Yes.
dog. We have 1,850 square feet. My father grew up in a house with two adults and five kids, and the entire house was the size of my living room and my office, right? And he
Wow.
grew up in the 60s, and so that was the middle class American dream right there. Also, they had one car. My understanding is that most households only had one car, even if there were two drivers back then. And now I don't know any dual income household that doesn't have at least two cars. I know
Yeah. I
several
mean,
single
we
income
have
households that have multiple cars.
we have three. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, and I've got two driving kids. But yeah, I grew up in a house the size smaller than the house that you're describing. And I mean, we didn't all live there at once, but my parents had 9 kids.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was like 10 people probably or 9 people living there at any given time. It was just
Mm.
basically, I mean, we every room got converted into a bedroom. The basement, the TV room, like there was just everything was bedroom. And if you worked and paid rent, you got your own room. So that like that squished the rest of us into, but we got out, we worked, everybody moved out when they were like 15. But yes, it was definitely clearly a lower standard of living.
Yeah. Yeah, so and it's difficult to capture that in an index. So one problem that I have is, some of your listeners may be familiar with the shadow stats, which purports to
Hmm.
measure inflation the same way that it was 40 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I love that
first
one.
of all, yeah, I mean, I love the idea, but there have been papers that have gone through and converted shadow stats measures to what happens when people do actually go through and measure the price index the way that it was done 40 years ago. They don't match up. And then the other,
Oh,
yeah, and then the other
really?
thing about shadow stats is if you really take that number seriously, the
Hmm.
economy hasn't grown in 40 years. Like that's how high those numbers are. They're so high that they erode the growth in GDP and national income, such that if you really, really want to believe those numbers, you're basically saying that we have not had any economic growth since
Hmm.
1980. So
Right. Interesting.
so I think the truth is really somewhere in between. There was a paper put out a couple when was it? It was earlier this year, I think. One of my favorite Harvard boys, Larry Summers. I think we've talked
Oh,
about how we
boy.
feel about that guy,
Oh my
but he did
God.
do some decent work. Where he was looking at the inflation rate over the last couple of years. What he was trying to reconcile is the fact that when you look at the correlation between the misery index, so there's a misery index that's basically unemployment and inflation, and consumer surveys, the consumer sentiment survey. They used to track each other really really closely, but there's been a gap the last couple of years where the consumer sentiment is lower than would be predicted by the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. And so their hypothesis going into it was, okay, what if we measured inflation the same with the same methodology that we had prior to 1984, because that's when the biggest change happened. Would this get rid of the difference that we see between the inflation rate, or the drop in the correlation between the inflation rate and the consumer sentiment? Would that explain why consumer sentiment is so much lower than we think it should be? And they found that, yes, in fact, most of that difference in consumer sentiment is explained by, or can be explained by, if you were measuring inflation the same way, then you would predict about the consumer sentiment that we've seen in the last couple of years. So, in other words, they did go back and they adjusted the index and tried to replicate what they were doing back in the early 80s and before that. And they found that, yes, inflation would be the official rates would be quite a bit higher if we were using
Mhm.
that method than they have been in the last couple of years.
But
So, like,
people, yeah, I mean, it isn't, it's obvious to everyone though that post COVID, and I would say obviously because they printed the shit out of money during COVID, like unbelievable, record breaking, all time human history type stuff.
five
that we
trillion
have.
dollars in 6 months. Yeah.
And yeah, yes. I mean, and everybody noticed that the price level went up. And I like to point out, and I'm sure I've mentioned this to you before, but I like to point out that maybe you don't know why inflation is bad, but it seems to me that whole thing was just the can kick from the tech crash in like 2000, like the really old one, kicked the can to the real estate crash in 2008. Um, and they just kept kicking the can and kept kicking the can. There should have been whatever kind of like a debt collapse or a correction.
Hmm.
And they just never let that happen. So what they were doing was they were trying to fill that hole with money so that the debt really wasn't worth that much. But what that really meant was our money wasn't worth that much. The prices go up. So now all the inflation that people are experiencing, I feel like, is us paying the price for those people getting bailed out along over the last 2 decades. What do you
Yeah,
think?
well, I definitely think it was helped along by a decade of zero interest rate policy. Whether it's the actual, because when you talk about that bubble and the collapse from it, we really should have seen a larger amount of deflation than we
Yeah.
saw. There was a good like single quarter in 2009 where prices dropped on a broad
But
basis, and I
they
think even that
they
was mostly
jammed all
gas.
those huge giant $1 trillion bailouts.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's why in my mind that we didn't see as much inflation, we didn't see as much deflation as
Right.
we otherwise would have. I mean, the Great Depression experience, and if you just look at other events pre-Federal Reserve, like the Panic of 1873, for example, when you see a collapse in private debt loads of that magnitude, then you're going to see a drop in prices. Often that drop is going to
Right.
be back to the level that they were at before the bubble
Yeah.
started.
That would have
That
been
was,
good for us
yeah.
because actually the real thing that I was even just trying to get at right now is the the inflation wouldn't bother us so much and interest rates wouldn't be like these are nominal interest rates that we're talking about. They
Hmm.
wouldn't feel so high if the wages were catching up. But if unemployment is increasing, you're not going to expect wages to catch up like at this fast pace.
Right, and I would also say that one reason that the interest rates feel so high right now is that
Oh
we
yeah.
had really subnormal interest rates for such a
Historically,
long
this isn't
time.
very high.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean buying. So that the house that I grew up in, I think my mom bought it in 2002, and her mortgage was 7%. And the Freddie Mac average this past week was 6.77, so lower than it was 22 years ago. Mortgage rates did go up to almost 8, or I think they breached 8 for a few weeks there, or have a couple times in the last year or so. But that's kind of an illusion, the
Mhm.
idea that these mortgage rates are just
I agree.
exorbitant is
Yeah.
is just kind of a what do you ever you call that, a recency bias, kind of a recency illusion as well. You got all these people who think that that's just astronomical, and it's like, no, it's really just that the 3 and the 2.85 and the 2.75 of 2020 and 2021 was what was astronomically low.
And
And now
but
you're
it's been
experiencing normal.
very, very low, at
Hmm.
least since 2008.
Absolutely, yes,
Yeah.
super low.
So, yeah, okay. So what are we talking about? We're talking about rising unemployment, right?
Yeah, so this is probably a good time to
Yeah.
anybody who is viewing this on a excuse me, I can't speak.
Supercomputer.
Yeah, anybody who is viewing this on a computer is going to benefit. Let's see. I guess I'm going to share this other monitor. I was hoping it would just let me share a window, but it looks like I
Yeah,
can't
yeah, it can
share a
share a
monitor.
window.
Oh, okay.
So you go to
So,
present and then it'll show you the tabs. I can do it
oh,
for you if you want.
sweet. No, no,
Yeah.
no, that's good. I
You
got it.
got it?
Okay, so now I'm going to shrink this so
Yeah.
it's a little more All right. So, what is the first thing that we're going to look at? Okay. So, this is a chart of the headline unemployment rate
You have to hit
over
it.
the
You
last
have
3
to
years.
tell it to share. Do you realize that?
Oh, sharing this tab to StreamYard. It says it's sharing.
Oh,
That's weird.
then maybe I need to do it. Sorry.
There it is. Okay, I see it. Cool. Yeah, so this is the headline unemployment rate over the last 3 years. This is April 2023, and a year ago, July 2023. This is what I'm talking about, where the unemployment rate pretty much hit the cycle low. And usually, the way that unemployment behaves is it doesn't go to an all-time low and then just stay there. Unemployment rates, they tend to spend the most amount of time in flux. So they're either dropping in the recovery from the previous recession, or they'll hang out for maybe a few months, a couple quarters, but then after that they're either going up or they're going down. And so you can see that it's always a U shape, and sometimes that U is shallower than other times between cycles, but this is what we got. In, I believe it was April of this year, maybe May, we reached what's called the SOM rule for the first time. And I may have shared that the last time I was on the show.
I
But
don't remember that.
Okay, so the SOM rule is what happens when you take the 12-month minimum, so the lowest unemployment rate of the last 12 months, and if you get 0.5% above that, then in every business cycle in the post-World War II experience, that has indicated that you're in a recession. So that's
Really?
the SOM rule.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
can see it obviously because it's below 3.5 and then it's above
Yeah.
4.0.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the 12-month low right now, because the 12-month moves in April 2023 was obviously more than a year ago, but the unemployment rate exactly a year ago, July 2023 was 3.5, and so we're already up to 4.1 as of June.
This is saying that we're in a recession as of. Oh,
Yeah,
is
this
the
would
red
say
arrow June?
the red arrow was June. Yeah, that's
Okay,
right.
okay.
The first time the SOM rule was breached was either April or May, where we managed to get 0.5% off the cycle low. So so this would suggest that second quarter 2024 is going to be an economic downturn, and that doesn't, I've really changed my perspective on how much that matters, for reasons that we'll kind of get to when we talk about markets. But to give a little bit of reasoning there, when you average out all of the recessions since 1920, the average drop in the stock market is only about 9.5%. So if you want to round up to 10. So there, in my mind, there's really no reason to, change investment allocations based on one business cycle. And I used to think that macro, like business cycle oriented investing was kind of a good idea. But at this point in my career, and after having done all the research that I've done and all of the investing that I've done, which is not a long career by any means. We're talking, my investment career so far is only 5 years. But I did try macro investing for the first like 3.5 of that, and now I follow other methods, So I don't think that
Macro
investment
investing
wise,
is what?
macro investing is when you try to is basically when you change your allocation of assets based on where you're at in the business cycle, or maybe based on what kind of economic regime you think you're going into. So that would be like you try to get into stocks when the economy is expanding and you think that growth is going to be at least normal or maybe high, and then you get out of stocks when it looks like we're going to have a recession. So it's a little bit like, I mean, I would
Like
call
timing the
it,
cycle, kind of.
yeah, I would call it data-driven market timing is maybe
Okay.
another way to say that. Yeah. I looked at every the behavior of the stock market going back to the 1920 recession, because we don't have great economic indicators from before that era. We do have stock data from before that, but not very good economic data. And like I said, you have an average drop of 10% in several cycles. I want to say half of them. The the stock market actually doesn't correct any more than it increases over the year before the recession and the year after. So what I mean by that is, let's say the stock market does go down 10%, but if you just take the market a year before the recession starts and a year after it's over, the stock market may go up 30. So you have a lot of those types of instances, and just things that don't make it worth it to
Yeah, take those chances.
right, yeah, to try
Make
and get in and
transactions. Yeah.
out. Exactly. So I'm gonna kind of describe what an alternative to that is here in a few minutes, once we kind of go over what's all these real kind of economic indicators. Um, so yeah, so that's the unemployment. I feel like we pretty much covered what's going on here. Did you have any more questions about the unemployment rate?
Nope.
Okay. And then the other thing, another way to measure the kind of impulse in the job market is what's going on with initial unemployment claims. And this is kind of fun, or at least useful, because it's a weekly index, or a weekly data point, rather. So every week, the Department of Labor reports on the amount of new unemployment claims. And what that is people filing for unemployment benefits. So they get those numbers on a weekly basis and report them every Thursday. And so I've kind of made a cycle indicator out of this. And we had what a lot of people thought was a recession back
Mm-hmm.
in 2023. And if you remember from this period, this is when a lot of people were saying that it was a technical recession, this rise here in the initial unemployment claims.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting that the rise in initial claims, but this is actually the behavior in all of the historical cycles. It tracks really, really well with the drop in GDP. So there were actually two negative quarters of GDP, which a lot of people call a technical recession.
In a row. Yeah.
In a row, yeah, consecutive in Q1 and Q2 of 2023. What we didn't see is an increase in the other labor market number, right, the unemployment rate. And so the people who decide whether it's a recession or not, they didn't come around to
Well,
deciding it was a recession.
those are
So,
two down quarters year over year.
yes. Yeah, that's right.
So, but if you look at what was happening the year prior, it was probably a raging rebound from lockdown.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So
That's
you
true.
can't count that,
Mm-hmm.
I think. You have to
Yeah.
normalize 2022 if you're going to do that, I think.
Well, yeah, and then for
Plus,
me,
I think the recession was the lockdown.
no, and I think
That's
of
what I think.
2020.
Yeah.
I think of 2020 as a fake recession. So, like, I
No,
don't
but
even.
they actually eliminated jobs and burned off inventory.
Yeah, they did. On the other hand, one thing that will actually, I can just show you this. So this is the private debt load in the U.S. economy. So this is how much private debt there is divided by the GDP.
Mhm.
So it's kind of like what would you call it? In a household, it would be a debt to income ratio, right? That would be what we're
I
looking at
see.
here, except economy wide. So it's the United States private
Right.
debt to GDP ratio. We're not looking at government, we're looking at private. And the reason that I think of the 2020 recession as kind of fake, there were a lot of layoffs, there were a lot of job losses, but I call it, or I would call it manufactured, at least, because
Oh, it's
while
definitely
you had,
manufactured. Yeah.
yeah, but in terms of its behavior with regard to like other business cycle indicators, like manufacturing, so anything having to do with labor behaved pretty much as it would during a recession. But things like spending and credit and the issuance of credit and loans and all those kinds of things didn't play along the same way that you would
That's true,
expect them
but
to in a cycle.
isn't the purpose of the recession to blow off excess jobs and inventory? Is there
Yeah, it's
any
like a
other
forest fire.
purpose? Yeah. So I feel like it did that, but
Well,
Uh,
no, yeah,
well,
so it blew off job. Okay, so here's what
and
it did.
bankruptcies.
Yeah, right. Here, but here's the point that I was trying to get at by showing this chart is that the private debt to GDP ratio shot up during this
Yeah,
time,
yeah,
and
I see
so
that. Yeah, and it went
what
right back down.
right what the recession should do is it should burn off the jobs where people are employed in what are not useful modes
Yeah.
of working, what are not useful activities.
Hmm.
And the reason that COVID, that the lockdown recession was not like a fundamental recession is because all of these jobs that were burned off in things that people still wanted to consume, right?
Right.
There was a huge loss in service work, and people by and large still really really like their services to be where they are. It
I would
was
have
only
to
that they couldn't
see
go out.
how much was like automated. Like I never really dug into those numbers, but
Hmm.
how many people are back doing the thing they were doing before, or was it actually was there a lot of reshuffling?
Yeah, yeah, and I haven't looked too far into it either, but I
Our
think you're
waitresses now iPads.
yeah,
Our
yeah.
waitress has been replaced by iPads. Have they? I actually haven't noticed that, but I don't eat out a fraction as much as I used to. Not even a
Yeah, me
tiny
neither.
fraction. I used to go
Hardly at
out
all.
once or twice a month, and now, just never. Not. I just learned how to cook, which I'm sure a lot of
Yeah.
people did, and want to eat
Yeah.
better and all that stuff. So there were definitely some fundamental changes. However, yes, not in things that were dying and needed to be burned off. I got that. They were burning green shoots, not green stuff, not dead stuff.
Yeah, and it was just this. So, to give one example, like you saw a bunch of small businesses in the service sector go out of business permanently when without those lockdowns, they would have had no problem staying in
Right.
business for maybe 10 years to
Heartbreaking.
come.
Criminal.
Criminal, yeah, criminally heartbreaking, absolutely. And then you saw all of this capital because of this, the increase in credit, and because of the increase
Yeah.
in the money supply, you saw this huge boom in investment into areas that have been proven completely worthless over the last couple of years. So, green energy, just because
Yeah.
everybody expected all of this flood of investment into green energy technologies and thought that that was going to be the future. Electric cars kind of had a bubble of its own.
Yeah,
If you
it's the
look at
command
the
and control stuff. They tell you what
yeah
to do. It's that centralized control. It absolutely doesn't work. I would wonder. I'd be curious to compare this to a war. If they killed
yeah, I think we
people,
would.
they purposed labor. There was debt.
Yeah, I think this would be most analogous to more of a
Okay.
war than like an organic business
Right.
cycle. I think that's a
Okay.
great way to put it. Yeah. You certainly had people removed from the labor force through death. You had people removed from the labor force through early retirement just because their assets were doing so well, right?
And for
um,
non-compliance.
and for non-compliance, yeah, not taking that
Think of what
thing.
that did to the
Oh,
medical field. Like you go to a hospital now, all those people have been screened for conformity.
yeah. Which means that they're probably, if your life is on the line, the kinds of people who are going to be treating you are going to be very close to a rule book that may not be what you need in that situation.
Agreed.
I
Or
would
be mean
guess.
to you
Yeah.
because you're not one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Compliance and TikTok dances, right?
That's true. That's true.
That was one of the most
Yeah, that
ridiculous
was
aspects of that
offensive.
whole thing. Yeah, I agree. So I think we've pretty much covered what's going on in the job market. But to kind of put a bow on that, the job market has been the thing that has allowed Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, to maintain this course of higher interest rates for longer. So there's been a lot of temptation to cut interest rates and a lot of pressure to cut interest rates, even on his own board. And what has made it so that the Fed has this classic juggling that they have to do between, or it's really a false dichotomy, but they have to balance the labor market with inflation, and they think that if they cut interest rates, then it's more likely to stoke the labor market. And if they raise interest rates, it's more likely to hurt the labor market. And it does the opposite of those things with inflation. He hasn't really had to juggle those priorities the same way that Volcker did because unemployment has stayed low. And so this is where, with the job market weakening, and the business cycle kind of turning around, obviously we don't know what the GDP is for this quarter. We won't know until what would it be? October, is the first time we're going to hear anything about Q2, or excuse me, Q3
But
2024.
joblessness, you said, we see it is rising.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if you actually identified a reason for that. Is it possible that it is because the companies have to pay more in financing costs, or what's the trigger there? Do you know?
Well, yeah, I really don't know.
Okay. I didn't know if that's been identified or not. So yes, we don't know. I mean, you could speculate, you could rattle things off, but you don't have a
Yeah,
strong opinion. Yeah. Okay.
you could absolutely speculate, but it could be that high prices are a cure for high prices. So what tends to
Yeah.
happen is eventually people really do, when the grocery bill goes up to goes from $400 a week to $700 a week, and you've maxed out your line of credit. Maybe it is just the fact that people are consuming less services because they can't.
Right.
Maybe it's just people being at the end of their budget. I'm really not sure. I think
Yep.
we'll be able to
Okay.
analyze that more in the future.
Okay.
In the 2008 debacle, a lot of it just came from massive layoffs in the home mortgage
Yes.
industry. A lot of people
Yes.
were employed either financing it or building it or
Yeah.
managing the construction of the
Absolutely.
houses.
No, I remember that. It was
So,
terrible because the year before they had given all sorts of incentives
mhm.
to buy equipment. So I knew all these guys who had dualies, like brand new trucks, and they had huge, huge payments because there was no end in sight, and it just fell off a cliff. That was terrible. But I knew
Yeah.
so many people who were affected by that.
Yep.
Yeah, but it's
Absolutely.
nothing like that now. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not really a sector we can point to necessarily
What's
and
that one
say,
that I'm
ah,
looking at? The
yes.
green and the blue?
Yeah. Okay, so what's going on here is nominal and real retail sales. And a lot of analysts, when they look at this, they'll exclude automotive purchases. If you look at the chart including automotives, the basic shape is the same. It's showing the exact same phenomenon that I'm showing here. So don't think that I'm like trying to pull the wool
Yeah.
over your eyes and make things look worse than they are. That chart looks exactly the same too. I'm just doing what's commonly done
Got
in,
it.
in this kind of realm. So the blue line is real retail sales, so that's adjusted for inflation, and then the green line is nominal. So the green line is the way that census reports it. This is not. This is an official data point. The census doesn't release an inflation adjusted version of this. So if you want to look at that, you got to do it yourself. So that's what I've done here. And so all I wanted to point out is that the blue line hasn't seen a new high since 2022, right? So inflation adjusted retail sales have actually been declining on net balance since mid 2022, about
And
2 years ago.
why am I not understanding why the divergence, and that's advanced, meaning like you're placing an order?
No. Advanced just means that it's a data release that they put out before they necessarily have all of the data.
Oh, okay, that's
Yeah.
still legit. So they're just
Yeah,
missing
that
the
word is.
mark. They're missing the mark. They're getting it wrong. Their expectations are being disappointed.
No, so this is the blue line is the same number as the green line adjusted for inflation. So what this is showing is that the
Oh, it says
amount of money,
nominal and real, I understand, but
yeah.
down there, it says real and advance. I don't understand what that means, but okay.
Okay, yeah. I should have when
Okay,
I'll
nominal and
redo
real,
this
I
and
understand.
then
Okay, so
yeah.
that's nominal.
Yeah. So
So,
green is
yeah,
nominal
yeah,
and
they're gonna be
blue is
close when
real.
there's low inflation, and it's gonna be high. It's gonna be there's gonna be a gap. That gap is the inflation.
Yeah, that gap is the inflation. But the interesting thing about spending, especially in the consumer space, is that when you're in a when the economy is expanding, that number, whether you adjust for inflation or not, is going to be going up.
Right.
So the difference is going to be larger, month over month, but the consumer is still going to be consuming the same or more amount of stuff. And what we've
See, and
seen
you
over
can
the last couple of
see
years is that it's dropping.
this
Like
is a
people are
good
actually getting less.
this is a good way to demonstrate that when if a company that has a ton of debt, nominal debt with a fixed interest rate, has certain amount of revenue, and there's a depression or collapse or something, 2008,
Hmm.
they aren't making the revenue to pay their debts.
Yes.
So
Right.
so the way you could bail them out if you didn't want them to just go bankrupt, and this is what I'm trying to say is what happened and what we're suffering from. If you could Keynes style, which is why he did it like this, inflate the money supply so that these people are still making the same nominal revenue, even
Hmm.
though there are
The
lower sales.
quantity drops.
Yeah,
Yep.
their
Hmm.
debt didn't go away. Their debt's the same. Their interest rate's the same because presumably it was fixed. That's common here. And now they still get to limp along because their revenues have gone up strictly because of inflation. And that's what we're paying. So
Hmm.
if the government's going to create an inflationary environment to bail people out, they actually gave people money, but yes, that's why we pay for this stuff sometimes. That's what it looks like in my opinion.
Yeah, and I broadly agree with that, and I think that after 2008, the government would have preferred to see more inflation than they actually
Oh,
got.
yes, they
They
wanted it so
really, really
bad.
wanted it.
That's
Yeah.
why they did COVID, in my opinion. So they could print money. They just couldn't take it anymore. 2% interest rates. There was no place to go.
Yeah, I'll send you a link, and then I'll post, and I'll go back and edit this blog post. But there was a 2019 collaboration between, well, I think it was written by BlackRock, but there were some Federal Reserve Board alum who were also on the team who wrote it. But it was called Going Direct, and
Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
essentially the theory was we haven't been able to create inflation through monetary policy. So, in the next major economic event, what has to happen, because they're just so passionate about creating inflation, and this is written by a fund management company, mind you. So these people are supposed to be trustworthy with the task of protecting your wealth,
Yeah.
right? And they're
Yeah.
just on a meta level,
Well, it makes their returns look better too, by the way.
I suppose, yes, I suppose so. Um, and they can, if their returns are bad, they can just blame inflation
Hmm.
because that's not their job. That's the Fed's job, even though they're working with Fed alum to. Anyway, um, so they wrote this paper called Going Direct, and it is really interesting to me that came out in 2019, and then the next year
Hmm.
you have a global economic event. Of course, the word pandemic you're not going to find in the Going Direct paper,
Yeah.
but less than a year later, you have this global economic event where the government does exactly, and the central banks do exactly what they prescribed had to be done in order to create inflation.
Right.
That's been really interesting to me. Uh, so yeah, the policymakers, they love inflation. That's what they do.
Hmm.
So yeah, so when we look at this, when the economy is growing, we should see, like, if I put these two different numbers, or I either index them or I put them on two different axes or whatever, they should be moving the same direction, right? Like, you shouldn't see this huge gap where the real number is dropping and the nominal number is increasing. But obviously we don't see that. There's a huge divergence, and there has been for the last couple of years. It looks like we had a spike here that looked like maybe things were recovering, and I don't remember exactly what was going on in late 2022, but it could be a holiday. I don't know. Everybody has a tendency to spend during Christmas, but so I don't know what the explanation is behind that spike, but yeah, but we see that huge divergence, and in the I'm gonna add this chart as well, but the amount of national income per head in the U.S. has actually not had a new high since, I believe it was the December 2022. That's the last time we saw an increase in national income per capita. Was December 2022.
Are you
So
showing
we've
us a
had
chart
these.
of that? That's the
No,
simulation.
I'm gonna
Okay.
add that to this post,
Okay.
so that it's, for listeners who want to go back and look, they can take a look. But so there's been this divergence between national income and gross domestic product. So and it's interesting because I think it's important. Nobody, like economists, they never look at per capita national income, and they really don't ever look at per capita GDP. But one thing that you tend to see in business cycles, at least since 1947, where we've been tracking this data, is and anytime you see anything about like economic indicators, GDP, spending this, investment spending that, all of those samples only go back to 1947. So, whenever somebody says that an indicator says this and therefore blah, 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 one thing that I've tried to keep in mind as well is that the sample size that we have is only 12 business cycles. No statistician would
Interesting.
accept that, right? No statistician would accept that as evidence because the minimum recommended sample
30.
size for any is 30. Exactly. Yeah, Yeah. So something that I've tried to keep in mind as well is like it could be the first time that this indicator has ever failed, but we're at less than half of the minimum sample size, so maybe we are in the next several years going to see a lot of that. And I don't know. I hope not, because it makes the world less predictable, and I like predictability, but it may be that way. We'll see.
Okay.
And then I wanted to we'll just take a look at what inflation's doing. So the post-war average inflation rate is 3.5%. What this chart is showing is the year-over-year change in the core consumer price index. That's the one that is dumb because it doesn't include food and energy. And
Mm-hmm.
then the broad inflation or the broad consumer price index. So the green line is core and the blue line is broad. So for the broad inflation, the broad consumer price index, the average year over year change is 3.5%. And for people who are looking forward to lower inflation, I don't know if that describes any of your listeners. Probably not, because they because they don't believe BS. But as far as inflation goes, it's gone up a lot. My personal basket of consumption goods and services is up at least 35-40% since 2019. And I think that's a lot of people have had the same experience. Don't expect it to come down. And don't expect the inflation rate to drop a whole lot more than it already has. Because the average rate
Right.
since World War II, since we basically had this fiat system, is 3.5%,
Yeah.
and the last reading was 2.9. So in June, prices on a year-over-year basis were up 2.9%. So we're already a little bit
Yeah.
below the average. That's about what we can expect, I think, going
And
forward.
they want to keep interest rates. I mean, I nothing's going to convince me that they didn't intentionally get interest rates back to a higher stasis. So they don't anyone who's expecting them to go way back down, that's the whole point was to get them up there. He might wiggle around a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, but I mean, unless they have a full on that, unless they're really going to go into they have a crash and they lower the rates and then raise the rates again, then I don't think that it's people shouldn't expect that new normal to come back.
Yeah, Powell's whole
It's going to be
mission from
normal.
the moment he stepped into the Fed was to normalize interest rates. So Janet Yellen very gradually started doing it, perfectly correlated with the Trump, with Trump being in the White House instead of Obama, by the way. She
Funny,
did wait. Yeah, it's funny how that works. The Fed's not political.
pathetic.
Um, yeah, she totally
Partisan
waited until Trump
nonsense.
got in.
Yeah.
Exactly. To start doing that. But his mission was to normalize interest rates, and it did bother a lot of central bankers that they seemed to be unable to get rates off the floor without causing all these problems like Repo Mageddon in September
Mhm.
2019.
Mhm.
And they want to do that because it gives them more room to play with. Their monetary policy is going to be more powerful if they're cutting the rate from 5 to 3 rather than 1.5 to 0, or
Right.
1.5 to half a
Definitely.
percent.
Yes,
So,
for sure.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that that's a goal. Um, now the Oh, you know what? Okay, so we already went through this chart of the private debt to GDP. All I was going to point out there is that there's been a huge deleveraging since basically 2021. And the inflationary pressures and when I say inflationary pressures, I mean the things that cause the inflation that we recognize, like, printing $5 trillion and putting it directly in retail bank accounts. That ended in the first quarter of 2021, or maybe it was April, which would be second quarter. I think that's the last major spending bill that went out. And almost at exactly the same time, the amount of leverage in the economy, as given by this private debt to GDP ratio, started to fall off. So there's been this deleveraging. And overall, and deleveraging just means that the amount of debt falls. Now, the dollar amount of debt has not fallen, at least as far as I know. But the way that you measure it is like that household debt to income ratio, and that's what this private debt to GDP is basically replicating at the country level. How much debt does the private economy in the U.S. have, and then how much income is it producing? So that's fallen off a cliff, and to me, that would say that if anything, the pressure on prices going forward is going to be deflationary. However, and there are a lot of monetarists as well, like Lacey Hunt is an example. If any of your listeners have listened to him, very intelligent guy with a long career in economics, but his feel or his view is that the deleveraging of all this debt is going to be a deflationary pressure, and so we're not going to see a whole lot of inflation going forward.
Hmm.
But in my view,
Well, in aggregate, right?
In aggregate, right? Whereas the way that I look at it is the debt load, or the expansion of credit, which debt is just the other side of that trade. Anytime credit expands, you have more debt.
Right.
So this number going up is more credit expansion, which is inflationary. This
Yep.
number going down is credit destruction, literally, which is deflationary. That's only one side of the balance beam, right? And so I think of it as you've got money, which comes into existence through credit. So let's say on one side of the balance beam, you've got credit, and then the other side, you've got production of stuff. And then in the middle, what balances them out is prices. And there's a lot of different policies and just crap going on in the world right now. Global conflict and the imposition of tariffs, the likelihood that whoever wins the White House, there's going to be an ongoing trade war with China that's just going to keep going. That could put a lot more pressure, downward pressure on the production of stuff than there is downward pressure on money, right? And so if that
So
happens,
your
then
prices
you're
are
going to have
still
higher,
high.
yeah, then you're still going to end up with higher inflation. Yeah, exactly. So I think these factors can kind of, sometimes I think that the policy and the global instability factor can kind of, can overtake whatever's going on with credit and money, is essentially what I'm getting at. Even though the monetarists say,
I was going to say,
inflation is
isn't
always and everywhere
inflation?
monetary.
Yeah, that's Friedman.
Yeah. And it is, right? Like, it would be impossible to have inflation across the board if you didn't have an increase in the money supply. But the reason that that's not necessarily a useful thing to say anymore is because we always have an increase in the money supply, right? Like, it's always going up. This is relative to GDP, but this debt, this credit is always going up. That's
Let me
just
ask
the
you a
way it
question.
works.
Someone showed me a chart. I was like, I don't like fractional reserve banking. That was my thing. I didn't like it. Whatever. I don't like it. Obviously, we're too far gone now, but he showed me a chart that I thought was flawed in many ways, but he was like, the growth of the money supply was like one-to-one correlated with the growth of the economy in real terms. So I also actually thought you could overlay the production of oil. Like, it was such a long chart from 125 years or whatever, that was actually also when, I think people underestimate how world-changing rock oil was compared to previous forms of energy. And I would say that could be
Agree.
just as much the cause, the engine for growth. But his argument was that whether it's like velocity of money or whatever, but just having money, actual dollars out there is what drives the economy. Is there anything to that? That you'd never have the kind of economic growth if we had a gold standard. That's his argument.
Hmm. Well, we did have a gold standard so during the heyday of United States economic growth, when we basically created the capital stock, built the capital stock that made us an economic superpower. So basically, I'm talking from the end of
Civil War.
end of the Civil War, yeah, through 1900 and even
Yeah.
World War One, let's call it. We did have a gold standard. We had an increasing money supply, but it was tethered to something.
Yeah.
We had a ton of
Like Bitcoin.
deflations.
You have to mine it.
Something, yeah, something. So it is true that during that time that bank money increased. So the amount of demand deposits in bank accounts rose. So it's not like we were on a 1-to-1 gold standard where the money supply could never increase. It was the base money didn't change, and
See,
then there was bank money expanding on top of that.
so the spike I recall from the chart was post the Fed, because I was like
Hmm.
end of the Fed. But you make a good point. When the capital stock was built, so you can play all sorts of games with those statistics. What is,
Hmm.
money begets money. So if you're going to have a chart straight up after the Fed and you're going to measure economic growth
Hmm.
in anything that relates to a dollar, then you could easily have that. Because you could also see that chart where it's like what a dollar in your pocket was worth. And
Yes.
now it's like 90, 199th of that. Like that chart looks
Ever
exactly the
since
same.
1913.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so yes, but it's so important. I think it's a function of youth and theoretical education that you don't really realize that what William Engdahl said, the best indicator of economic growth or health or prosperity was steel. I've mentioned this to you before.
Hmm.
Steel. Look at how much steel you're making or buying or importing or using. And that's how you know whether a country is growing or thriving. It's the real stuff. And that's why it annoyed me that they bailed out all those, bankrupt entities, because it's not like factories would crumble. Like you would
Hmm.
still have that. That's what bankruptcy is for. And
Market would find a price for the factories and get
yeah,
them redeployed doing things that people needed.
yeah, the
Yeah.
creative destruction thing. It's just, but it's good to remember, as you pointed out, that the actual boom, the actual real boom, which you can see it with your eyes, was when the country was built. And I actually think there has to be something screwy going on, because I mean, how much is there? No, it's kind of like defense spending. Does it have to be $1 trillion a year? Couldn't it be
Hmm.
like $1 trillion 1 year and then you just replace the stuff? We've built, if you go to England and you see houses that were built in the 1600s. I mean, I don't know if you've ever really walked around London. They'll like have
Oh, I
cornerstones.
have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
oh,
In
yeah. So
Scotland.
not just the fancy places, but like
Hmm.
people live in houses that say they were built in the 1600s because they're built of brick. I'm like, okay, so if all the houses are built,
Hmm.
why do we still have to work 80 hours a week or whatever? Like it's just crazy.
Yeah. The other thing too is you could say, oh, but if we're all just living in the same houses that we've had for 3 centuries, then who we're losing economic activity because there's nobody building the houses. But
Broken
it's
windows.
broken windows, yeah. But it's like if if all you're doing is tearing down and replacing perfectly good places to live, then that's
Well,
not really an increase in wealth.
that idea of productivity is again skewed by the monetization of everything, because actually what you could do if you didn't have to worry about paying your mortgage, you could just take that little piece of land and grow, like you can grow Yukon gold potatoes in your backyard. I did it by
Hmm.
accident. You could actually cultivate a homestead without really sweating it. You could certainly take care of your own children. I mean, there is man will work. I think that was a Albert J. Nock thing from Our Enemy, the State. He said, "We will never solve our problems as long as people think that a job is a thing to be given." And it
Hmm.
took so long for me. Like, I just did not understand that at first pass. And then over the years, I've been like, that is so true. That is so true. But I think that the powers that be know that that's very threatening, and they don't want you to be able to just say, well, I own this house, and I understand people have children, but now people aren't even having children. You could literally just give your house to your kids, which is what I'm hoping to do.
Hmm.
But, yeah, and they subsidize that. Actually, I would say that's the most subsidized thing, is that infrastructures, real estates, roads. Like, building a road is subsidizing a real estate development. Building, giving tax deduction for mortgages subsidizes, yes, banks, but it also subsidizes real estate developments. Real estate developments getting tax breaks, like they get it. It's just I always feel like liberals should be totally against all kind of like inflation, infrastructure, because that's the stuff they say is like there to stimulate the economy, but that's what
Hmm.
stimulates the transactions. The transactions are of course going to create a little bit of entropy. Like, anyway, you know what I'm saying?
Well, and I would say that I would think that if anybody should really be against inflation, it should be the left, because the distortions, that the constant changes in prices, and the unevenness of how that money gets out to the economy is what creates the median household income may go up a lot over time, but the income to somebody who works in financing a house is, because the value of houses keeps going up so much, right? Because of that inflation and the fact that everybody knows inflation is in the system, so they're putting their money into hard assets. So the price of the house is going up a lot. The wages and salaries of the people who finance the house are probably going to go up a lot. What's probably not going to go up a lot is the jobs that don't require a ton of skill but are employed maintaining that house. So the income of the people painting the house, or the income of the people mowing the lawn of the house. And so that, in my mind, is why you should see a lot more anti-inflation sentiment on the left, because those distortions are what create the inequality that they purport to hate so much.
And yes, and I think another thing is that inflation, the holders of assets benefit from inflation, and the wage
Mm-hmm.
earner, it takes a long time for the wage earner, for the wages to catch up. They're called sticky wages, and Keynes actually promoted them, said
Mm-hmm.
that we can keep wages low by the inflating it away, because you can never cut their pay. People won't
One of
accept a
the
pay cut.
Right, and one of the academic reasons that is commonly given for having a 2% inflation target instead of zero, I found this, like, uh, just looking at research and papers that are written by, like, the government economists and the people at the Fed and stuff like that. But one of the most common reasons given is that you can effectively give somebody a pay cut without, like you were saying, you can effectively give somebody a pay cut without actually dropping their wage, so that they don't actually know that they're getting
Yeah,
a pay cut. Their wage still looks the same.
yeah.
And
It's the
to me,
purpose.
yeah, and to me, that's just an insane thing. Like, first of all, if I actually believe that, I would never say it out loud.
Yeah, it's so immoral, and
Right?
it really it reflects that elitism that's at the heart of Keynesianism and
Hmm.
liberalism generally.
Yeah,
And people
I agree.
believe it, and they're meant to not understand economics at all, so that they can't figure that out. But it's just, I mean, you can just not have to understand economics and just think about how things should be. Like, it doesn't really make sense that I probably can trace my ancestry back 4 million years. Why
Hmm.
did I not inherit a house? I mean, well, actually, to my mother's credit, she did leave that house paid off, but she had 9 kids. So, Not one
Oof.
person could get it. However, most people
Yeah.
don't have 9 kids. And I have to say that was she lived hand to mouth. I mean, she really lived borderline impoverished, and
I
she
remember you
just
talking
wouldn't.
about that on a
My,
recent
my
episode. Yeah.
mom, yeah, she wouldn't have anybody come in, no nurses. And then when, I mean, I think I'm going to get a check unbelievably from this woman who's like was dirt poor. And I honestly think she would, now I reflect on it, I think she wouldn't let anybody come in to help because she knew that in the last year of life, people just spend all of their money on healthcare, and she just wouldn't do it. So she wanted to leave something. She was good like that. Anyway, I got to respect that. Respect my, and of course, I'm sure I'll spend it in like, first year it'll be gone. It's not much, it's whatever. It's a house in New York. Um, that small house we were talking about in
Right.
the suburbs of New York, but I mean, it wouldn't even pay 1 year of my kids' tuition, which you know what I mean? But it's just like her idea of money. She just took that from Ireland,
Mm-hmm.
and she would not, she thought the whole medical establishment was a complete scam. Anytime she's just like, they just want your money. They just want your money.
A lot of
It's
truth to
true.
that.
She lived a lot longer than my father. My father really did die in a hospital of medical malpractice, and because
Oh,
he
geez.
just wasn't afraid. She was afraid of it. Anyway,
Hmm.
little aside,
Wow.
but they do say having your own home is like owning it, paying it off is like a middle class person's best savings, and it is powerful. And I think that's why they're trying so hard to eliminate that. I mean, like, do you have any observations about like here? They have a horrible housing crisis in LA and
Oh,
Pasadena's
absolutely.
also. And I am not kidding. They just passed a rent control. I mean, I remember people standing on the street that obviously paid to get petition sign. These people were being paid to get you to sign up. And it just,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not very confrontational, but that just pissed me off. I was like, that is the worst thing you could do. You will absolutely dry up. No one will move out of their existing apartments. Nobody will want to
Yeah.
build that stuff. Nobody will want to own it. It is an absolute abject failure. And it can only be for nefarious purposes. They want to perpetuate this crisis so they can force this affordable housing in better neighborhoods. It's messed up.
Yeah. Well, I didn't actually know that they had passed rent control in Los
It might
Angeles.
might have
Wow,
been
that's
just
crazy.
Pasadena.
Okay, Pasadena.
Might have
Hmm.
been.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. In 2006, Milton Friedman, I think it was maybe it was 2003, 2004. Milton Friedman said in an interview, this is just a couple years before he died, and he said he was asked the question, well, don't you think it's a success on your part that people don't propose price controls as an anecdote to inflation anymore? And he said, no. This has nothing to do with my work as an economist or the economic science. The only reason that people are not proposing this is because they're old enough to remember that it didn't work. And he said,
Yes.
as soon as a generation that remembers it dies off and a new generation is making the rules, they will repeat the same mistakes.
Interesting.
So,
He's so right about that. I've thought of that.
yeah.
If only we lived a little bit longer. But they're taking care of that as well.
Yeah, with like diseases that
Yeah.
happen to target the old.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
True. So what do you have any what's your position on how to, you're an investor. What investment environment do you think this is best for? What we're doing right now? What would you do?
Oh yeah, yeah. Glad you asked because well, I think a second ago you were asking about the usage of a paid off home for the middle class as kind of as one of those things, and I think that that's a really good thing to have because one thing that is really helpful when you're in retirement and if you're no longer able to work, one maybe I'll feel differently when I get there, but I also don't necessarily believe in retiring when you're 65. But maybe that's just my mindset. It's hard for me to imagine just like getting up and
No, it's bad
you
for you.
know, yeah, and hanging out all day. Like I want to at least do something. But again, anybody who's older than me is gonna listen to that and say you don't know shit,
Yeah.
because
I can't
you're
wait to
you're
not do anything. I just feel like you would just you'd start cocktailing at like 10 a.m. And
Yeah.
I don't know.
I would be a 10 a.m. beer drinker, and I would sit on my porch. I would start smoking again. I
Yeah.
would smoke cigarettes on my porch and drink beer and tell kids to F off.
You would, yes. So, or you'd be rich enough so that you could actually spend money to occupy your time, which is like,
Mhm.
I'm always thinking, well, I'm kind of rich enough to do nothing, kind of like out of office space, but I'm not rich enough to do something. So that
Okay,
would be
yeah,
the
that's
thing.
really
Like
interesting.
if you could, these guys who play golf, join a golf club or whatever, that's incredibly expensive.
Like
So
travel all the time.
yes, and that's somebody
Yeah.
told me, it's like, "Oh, retire in your 60s and spend the whole decade traveling around the world." And I'm like, "Well, if I retire, my husband retires in his 60s, I'm not sure he'll have the money to spend 10 years traveling around the world. Like it's one or the
Yeah.
other."
Plus, I want to travel when my joints work. You know,
Well, that's what no, in your 60s your joints still work. It's after that that you got
mine won't.
problems, but you've got to that's the thing. You if you're going to take 10 years to travel, it's got to be after you have enough money. And I think that the system's set up that you work until you are not fully functional anymore. It's kind of baked in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. If one of your retirement decades is going to be the traveling one, then yeah, it should be your 60s. Um, Smoking and drinking are purpose. I like it.
we've got the
Man,
we got the
if I
core group here.
if I
Joe,
could
not a
if I could
fad.
find my
Stella, Stu. Getting good.
It's
JC.
funny. If I could find my way to a way to convince myself of that, I'd probably be a lot happier.
Oh
um
yes.
That's funny. Yeah, that's hilarious. So if you live in a paid off house, then all you got to worry about is the property taxes, which are as much as they suck, are generally cheaper than rent, right? So it's definitely a good idea to. But it also depends on what kind of personality you are. So some people have enough of a future focused kind of investment discipline where if they take the money that they would have spent maintaining a house, all of that extra shit that goes into it when you're not uh, the expense of being a homeowner versus a renter, right?
Yeah.
So a mortgage is often cheaper. There are a lot of times when you'll do the
Yep.
calculation, it's like a mortgage is cheaper than rent, WTF. And that makes a lot of renters think that they can afford a house, and it's like, no, that's not what that means. But you spend thousands in every homeowner emergency that you can't fix yourself is at least $1,000.
Just the water
So
for the sprinklers. When I got my first house, we were
that's
really close
insane.
to not being able to afford it. And we put sprinklers in the
Yeah.
backyard. And the
Yep.
water bill was so high. We were like, what? How can
Hmm.
we? It was breaking us, like things like that. You just do
Yep.
not realize, and all the little things that break constantly. And then I bought this house, which is like almost 100 years old, but it's
Hmm.
actually because it's pier and beam. You can see the plumbing underneath. So when they have to
Oh, that's
fix stuff,
handy.
it's really not that expensive. And that was
Yeah.
my thing. I was like, I want to see those pipes with my own
Hmm.
eyes.
Hmm.
And I mean, I've opened that up and reached my hand in there. Like that's the thing is if it's easy to fix, it's when you don't know what the hell it is and they've got to start chipping away at concrete. So yes, all of
Yeah.
these things are the nightmare of the homeowner.
Yeah.
But in
So
the
there.
end, especially if you had low interest rates,
Mhm.
it's 30 years will pass one way or another.
Right, exactly. And so I'm framing this as if you're of a super disciplined kind of investment and savings mindset, then you can you can take all of that money that you would have spent maintaining a house, and you can instead put it in a portfolio of other assets that are going to
Including
gain
the tax benefits.
including the tax benefits. Yeah, because well, you can fund so when you fund a Roth IRA, for example, you're not paying capital gains tax on it.
Mhm.
And even if you, I, th- I'd have to look at that, but and it's limited. But so you can fund a retirement account that you don't have to pay capital gains taxes on. You still have to pay income taxes and that stuff. When you still have to pay income taxes before or when you start drawing on it, depending on what kind of IRA it is. But you don't have to pay the capital gains if it's in a retirement account. Um, you still there? Did you freeze?
Yeah, no, we froze, but
Oh
we're
crap.
still here. Maybe
Okay.
that's the Big Brother's way of telling us that.
You will
We're
fund your
overstaying our
401k.
welcome.
Yeah. Um, so a really disciplined, investment-minded person can make a much larger. I really need to go through and do the calculation on this. Maybe I'll put that. I'll write that down because that would be a really interesting exercise. Um, who is that guy?
Oh, do you see it?
Yeah.
That is Grizzly.
Okay.
He's a Greek weightlifter.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, am I back? Okay, keep going.
Yeah, so you can put that money that you would have spent maintaining a house for 30 years and earn actually a lot larger returns off of a combination of stocks, bonds, certain types of hedge funds that I'm going to cover here in a minute, and gold, just more liquid financial assets you can make much larger returns on. So if you have that personality, then it's definitely something to consider. Most people don't. And so the house is a forced saving vehicle to
Yeah,
cover the place where you live when, you
yeah,
stop
that
working,
works for
which
me.
is fine too.
That's
Yeah,
my
I agree.
personality.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not very miserly myself, so
Yeah,
I like nice recording gadgets and nice computers and um, you know, expensive food
yeah.
sometimes and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So definitely a good idea to own a house and have it paid off by the time you retire. Very, very good goal to have, no matter what the interest rate is, because if the interest rate goes down, then you can
Yes.
refinance it. And if the interest rate goes up, then you'll be saying, well, I'm sure glad I locked in that low interest rate, right?
And when
So,
the rates were low, the values get high.
mhm,
So if you
yeah,
care
and
about
right.
property, if you're in a high property tax environment, you actually might
Hmm.
prefer to get a low price and a high rate in the hopes of refinancing later because you're probably not going to be able to walk back the property tax. Here, property taxes get locked in when you buy the house forever.
Hmm. Oh,
So,
that's not
yeah.
how it works where I live.
Yeah, but I mean these houses are millions of dollars for just nothing,
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you can't keep going up with the market. Like people would really have to leave their homes. The taxes are through the roof.
Yeah.
So, yes. So, yeah, I'm not that person, but I think that there are plenty of people out there like that.
Yeah.
Not me.
Agreed. I'm
So,
sure there are.
did we miss anything that you wanted to cover?
All I was gonna do is put forward kind of a model for a portfolio that people can think of. Obviously, this is not. I'm not a registered financial advisor, so this is not financial advice. But what I'm sharing with you is kind of the mental model that I use for my financial asset allocations. So I mentioned earlier that you don't want to try to invest, or that I certainly don't want to try to invest around the business cycle because the returns to doing that and the probability that you're wrong and are timing it incorrectly are just too damn high. Um, so, what you can do instead, and what I'm doing with my own assets, and keep in mind when we talk about asset allocations that everybody's situation as far as where their ability to retire is and what kind of types of accounts they can use is different. So, like for me, I have a 401k, and that's great because it comes with an employer match. But, and a lot of people will probably relate to this, it's also not great because it doesn't come with that many options. In my 401k, and for anybody who has one in your 401k, you basically have different combinations of stocks and bonds. That's all you have. That's all your employer has worked with their investment fund manager to create for you. Okay. And so, in order to take advantage of some of these other hedging opportunities, in order to buy assets that are going to do well when the economy turns down, you're going to need to make the decision to invest outside of that 401k, which kind of sucks because it doesn't come with an employer match, but it is worth it, right? You just can't put all of your eggs in a stock and bond basket and expect everything to be okay. So because of the realities of a 401k match, and then you have contribution limits on things like Roth IRAs and things like that, it's probably going to be pretty hard for most people. It's difficult for me to replicate the exact percentages that I want in terms of the asset classes that I'm in. But there's still a huge diversifying benefit to getting close, at least. Um, so the two assets, and the good thing about this is that it's really easy. So the average investor is in 70% stocks and 30% bonds. The way that I tend to think about this is to put half of your financial portfolio in assets that do well when times are good. When I say times are good, there's not a lot of war and inflation is falling and interest rates are falling. That describes the last 40 years, right? Good
Yeah.
times, your bonds tend, because the Fed cuts rates and is able to cut rates a lot, your bonds go up when your stocks go down. So you can do this 70-30 thing and it works pretty well.
Yeah.
Well, that 70-30 or the 60-40 portfolio is the benchmark that people talk about a lot more, but I'm talking about the actual average that people are invested in the US.
Yeah.
Well, that 70-30 doesn't really stand the test of time any earlier than 1985. Because it's only in that last 40 years where we've had this coincidence of not a whole lot of war. And I mean, we've had plenty of wars. The U.S. has been at,
Right.
but it hasn't been big wars. Like, we're not talking about American Civil War and World
Yeah.
War
But
One.
everything that
And
you're talking about does look like it's about to change.
yeah, what's going on in the Middle
Like you
East
said,
right now, I
inflation and,
think.
what?
Yeah, what's going on in the Middle East right now, and then
Yeah.
the deglobalization
Yeah.
with the U.S. entering a perpetual trade war with China, and then probably a hot war here in the next several years.
Ugh.
I don't think that there's any way that that doesn't happen, frankly.
Shit.
I think I totally think that there's going to be a stoppage of all investment, at least between the U.S. and China, and I think that we will absolutely see a hot war here in the next probably 5, 10 at the most.
Interesting.
Yeah, I really do think that that's going to happen, and it's unfortunate. I don't think it should happen, but I think that's on the way. So. And I think it's going to be a lot like Ukraine, where the U.S. will fight the Chinese to the last Taiwanese. I think it's going to start
Hmm.
there, and
Hmm.
then
Yeah.
maybe
Right. Well
kind of
put.
go out of yeah. So the assets that do well in times of, decent stability, economic growth doesn't even have to be that high. The stock market has multiplied, has gone up 200% since 2008, and it's been the slowest decade and a half of economic growth in basically the entire experience of, the modern economy, right?
Hmm.
So economic doesn't have to be high for stocks to do really well. And that's another reason that macro is not such a great framework for investing in my mind. So you have half of your portfolio doing that. So let's take your 70-30, and if you're going to reduce that by half, that becomes 35-15, right? So 35 stocks and 15% bonds.
Those
And
are the first
then
two things on your MSCITR.
Yeah. So MSCI is like the global stock market index, and then U.S. bond, global stock market index total return, and then
Got it.
bonds, U.S. bond total return.
That one I see.
Yeah, and so you can, and so for the other half, you want to have some financial assets that do well in the unstable times, when interest rates are increasing, when inflation is going up, and when there's a lot of trade wars and deglobalization, and the prospect of war leading to less trade, which basically drives inflation. Global instability, just for the bad times and for the recessions and a financial crisis here and there and things like that. And so two assets that in my mind are easy to understand and easy to buy are gold and what are called commodity trading advisory funds. Which is a hedge fund. This is a type of hedge fund. You can do it yourself, but it takes a lot of time and expertise to do yourself. If you're interested in doing that, I'm very educated in that space, and I run similar strategies with stocks. So you can, contact me via my blog if you want some more information about that.
How do they tell people that? What's your blog?
Oh, jpurcell.me.
And there's a contact clicky.
Yeah. If you go to join, and then you can put in,
Got
I
it.
think I have an option to put in a note.
Okay.
or the email address is contact@jpurcell.me. And so
Perfect.
what this chart is showing is the difference in the average monthly return. This goes back the last 50 years basically, so it's including the great inflation of the 1970s. So the blue bar is the average monthly return for that asset class, and then the orange bar is the average monthly return in months where interest rates were rising. And so what you see with the global stocks is that they drop about by a third when interest rates are rising. So the average return in stocks drops by about a third. That's not great. The average return in bonds basically falls to
Wow. Goes
nothing.
to nothing.
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh, you're talking about the return, not the underlying asset value.
right. Not your principal
They're not
value, but
negative returns. Yeah.
they're not negative. Yeah, a lot of times they are. Like
Yeah.
the
Right.
bond,
Right. Yeah.
a portfolio of long bonds lost, I think, 20% just from 2021 to 2022 because of all the inflation
Hmm.
and the rate hikes. Gold stays about the same. So you go from 0.58% a month to 0.54. So that's the kind of stability that you want when times are uncertain and times are tough. And then the commodity trading advisory funds. This is also called a trend following fund or a managed futures fund. So those hedge funds do better, a little bit better actually, when interest rates are rising, and they do
What's
better when
in that?
inflation.
Anything?
So what that is a hedge fund that is trading commodity futures and financial futures based on their trends. So imagine that the price of oil goes from, let's say, $30 all the way to $130. So a CTA fund is employing algorithm. I don't want to say algorithm because it's not truly an algorithm, but they're systematically trading moves like that in order to make gains off of a slice of that increase in the price of oil and then get out when it starts to go down.
But are
Um,
financial futures? What are financial futures? You bet on like interest rates?
yeah. So there's a futures contract on the Fed funds rate itself. So that's a thing. There's futures contracts on certain stock market indices like the Russell
But
2000, the S&P
those are
500, the Nasdaq.
that kind of thing is pretty expensive if you're on the wrong side of it though, right?
Well, exactly. And that's why I don't recommend that anybody do this themselves unless their account size is large enough. And I've calculated that to be, the account size that you would need to have even to trade a portfolio of mini futures contracts, mini MINI, because they do make minis now, would be for most of those types of futures contracts is going to be $100,000. If you have any less than that, then you really
So,
don't want to do that.
but what you're saying, is this like basically you can access it like an ETF?
So there are a couple of trend following. Like I said, if you hear trend following, time series momentum, CTA, or managed futures, those basically all mean the same thing. You can access it through an ETF. What I do is just put it in a fund, a closed-end investment fund, and those do come with minimums. The lowest that I've seen is 2,000, $2,500, which, as far as an investment minimum goes, is not all that much. There's a lot larger ones out there. There are a lot of hedge funds that'll only manage your money if it's at least $100,000 or even $1 million, right? So they do often come with a minimum, and that's going to be around $2,500. And then you can, whatever the 30% is the target for me. So whatever 30% of your portfolio is, you can put that money in the fund and have them manage it. But that's what they're doing. And the way that I think about this is for one thing, they're following price action. So they're not making a prediction that oil is going to go up and then trying to get into
Hmm.
oil before oil goes up and then trying to get out of it. And then trying to call a top, essentially. Actually, to put this even more simply, the typical investment mantra is buy low, sell high. Trend following is buy a little bit high and sell much higher.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's you pick up
Yeah,
on the trend, you
that's
get
probably
in, you get a slice of the trend,
yeah,
and then you get out.
yeah.
Right.
I agree with that. That's probably better. Yeah, than
Well, I think
predicting
it's
a change of direction is
yes.
really hard, or trying
Yes.
to hit the bottom or the top is just impossible.
I agree, and that's why I don't think again, macro trading. That's why I think that that's such a crapshoot, is because you are predicting a
Yeah.
direction not only in a system as large and complex as an economy, but then trying to infer from the behavior of
Yes.
the economy what the translation of
Policy.
that is going to be
Yeah.
into the market,
And the
which is
policy reactions
and the
can be
policy
unpredictable.
reactions. Absolutely. Um, yeah, like Peter Schiff, for example, he correctly called that there was going to be a mortgage crisis and a home industry crisis, a
In
giant
2008.
crash.
Yeah.
Yeah, but his call was for the dollar to go a lot lower because of the huge debt overload that resulted from that bubble. And the dollar actually went up significantly after that crisis and has for several years. The dollar has beat every large global currency over the last 10 years. It's appreciated against all of them. Um, so so you can have a so what all of that example is to say is that you can correctly call what the macro event is going to be and
Yes.
completely get wrong what the
Totally.
market response
Yes.
is going to be.
I
Right.
have been burned by that myself many
Me too.
times. Too
Me too.
smart for your own good. Forget it.
Yeah. For me, I stopped because I got into bonds too early in 2022 because the momentum on the recession trade and on the recession call was so high at that point that there was enough evidence to suggest, and even in like March 2023, we had full
Yeah.
on banking failures. So there was enough information out there to suggest that there was going to be rate cuts. And guess what? Rates kept going up. He didn't stop.
Yeah.
They didn't stop raising rates until that July. So
No,
yeah,
it's very
it's a
hard to
crapshoot.
predict that stuff. Yeah, you gotta
Yeah.
go with something more stable. I agree with you.
Hmm.
So excellent. All right. Well, just tell people where you want them to find you,
Yeah.
and your newsletter and whatever you think that will be fun for them.
Sure thing. So you can get on the newsletter at jpurcell.me/newsletter. I am trying to be a good follow on Twitter. So that would be x.com/jasonsdeli1821. Jason's Deli 1821 is how you can find me on Twitter. And basically every piece of content that I produce, every podcast like this that I do, every blog post is going to be shared on Twitter. So if you just like want one thing to be able to see everything, then that would be the most efficient probably, because everything I do, it's going to show up on there. So but yeah, I think that's and if you have any just random questions, because I really do like to just get more of a view of what people are looking at and thinking about that who are not me, because I'm kind of weird. And so the way that and the questions that I think of are not the same as most people. So if you just have any random questions about like what's going on in the world or financial markets or economics or whatever, just feel free to send me an email at contact@jpurcell.me, because I really love getting that type of input. It's very useful and enjoyable. So
I'm writing it down. Let's see. Okay, excellent. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming and hanging out. That was super awesome. Wait.
yeah,
I
anybody
need
who's on the live stream, thank you.
Let's see
Thanks
if
for
people want to say something. I
coming.
need to holler at Jason. At least I've invested about 6 more quarts of peas in my freezer. Stu is all right. I have to start from the top for that. Did I see he was killing chickens while listening? Maybe not.
Oh,
Yeah, there's a lot of chatter going on there. In the future, I'll tell people to like write Jason to see if we have questions.
Okay.
But okay, so let us call it a day. We'll do it again soon. We'll have another economic update. We'll invite people to comment and chat. But in the meanwhile, you can talk to Jason directly at contact@jpurcell.me. But of course, I do love Twitter too. Like everything I do is on Twitter. So that's at Jason's Deli 1821. And of course, I'm at Monica Perez Show. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks for having me on again. I really appreciate it.
Okay, don't go away.